Okay boys, I'm just going to show you a quick video to show you how to solve these logic puzzles. Each of the clues will give you at least 3 pieces of information at the beginning. So if we look at clue 1, the Leaden drove 25 miles further than the automobile with a high speed of 75 miles per hour. This means the Leaden cannot be the car that drove 75 miles per hour. Also, the Leaden cannot be this one here, and the Leaden. This clue also tells you that the car that drove 75 miles per hour cannot have driven the max distance, because the Leaden drove further than it. So 75 miles per hour cannot be 600. Clue 2. The Poultice drove 25 miles farther than the automobile with a high speed of 69. That tells us that the Poultice cannot be 525, because it cannot be the minimum distance, because the Poultice drove further than something else. The Poultice is definitely not the same car as the one that drove 69, so that's that one. And the Poultice, the car that drove or that reached 69 miles per hour cannot be the car that drove 600 miles, because again the Poultice drove further than it. Clue 3. The Awick drove somewhat less than the automobile with a high speed of 81. Well, that means that the Awick cannot be the max distance car, because the Awick drove less than another car. It also tells us that the car that drove or reached 81 miles per hour cannot be the minimum distance, because again the Awick drove less than it. So the car that reached 81 cannot be the minimum distance, because another car drove less than it. We have another piece of information. Obviously the Awick is not the same car as the 81. Clue 4. The car with a high speed of 69 drove further than the automobile with a high speed of 81. Well, if that's the case, the car with a high speed of 69 cannot be the minimum distance car. Simply not possible. And by the same token, the car that reached 81 miles per hour cannot be the maximum distance car. Now this obviously leaves only one slot for 600 miles, that one. We can also fill in these, because if this is green, well then these must be red. And then because there's 3 red here, this one must be green. This is the basics of logic. If there's 3 wrongs, that means the last one is right. Now, let's fill in just some more reds here for a second. If that's green, then these 3 must be red. Now, let's go back to clue 4 here. The car with a high speed of 69 drove somewhat farther than the automobile with a high speed of 81. Well, that means, forget about this column for a second. The car with 69 drove further than the speed of 81. Well, the car that reached 69 can only be 2 possible distances, and the car that reached 81 can only be 2 possible distances. And we know that the car that reached 69 drove further than the car with 81. Which would imply that this one has got to be 69 and this one has got to be 81. Now, using all of that data, we can fill in the rest. Let's go back to the beginning. The Leaden drove 25 miles farther than the automobile with a high speed of 75. The Leaden drove... Now, the car that reached a high speed of 75 was the car that drove 525. Well, the Leaden drove further, 25 miles further than the car that reached 525, so the Leaden must be this one. Excuse me, it should be green. Which means we can fill in these as red, and these as red as well. Let's go back to clue 2. The Poultice drove 25 miles farther than the automobile with a high speed of 69. Well, the car that drove 69 was this car, it drove 575, and the poultice drove 25 miles farther, which means the poultice must be this one. Which means we can get out our red and fill in this one and this one. Let's go back here. The AWIC drove somewhat less than the automobile with a high speed of 81. Well, the car that reached a high speed of 81 was the car that drove it for 550 miles. So the AWIC must be less than that. So the AWIC must be this one. Which means this one's red. And this one's red. And this one's green. Now we can easily fill in the rest because we have enough information to do both. The AWIC corresponds to 525 and 525 corresponds to 75. So AWIC must correspond to 75. The leaden corresponds to 550 and 550 corresponds to 81, which means leaden must correspond to 81. The poultice corresponds to 600 and 600 corresponds to 62, which means poultice must correspond to 62. And the last one, of course, if we fill in all the reds, that has to be, these all must be red, and these, and these, and this, and this. Well, then that leaves this one as green, and we can confirm that because if we go to the versum, it corresponds to 575, and 575 corresponds to 69, which means versum corresponds to 69. That's the quickest I can show you how to do this. It takes practice, you've got to stay with it. All of these logic puzzles are more or less the same thing. You're trying to find out what is not true so that you are left with only what is true. Thank you for listening, and best of luck with the rest of them.